grows. They give their testament to my suspicions. I will start the purge. I will root out the madness. Only I can do it.
These words, coming from the third diary entry of Captain Rudimer, show us best the beginning of the end for the man known as Rudimer, and the start of the monster stalking us through the darkness of the dungeons, only known as Crowmauler. Before we start, I would like to remind everyone that I am going to use a pretty old and in some way dated theory to analyze a fictional character, so don't take this too seriously. With that being said, let's start. In this video, through the lens of the structural model of the mind by Sigmund Freud, I'm gonna try and explain how the dungeons can slowly destroy the self of the unfortunate souls trapped in them, leaving them only with animalistic instincts, extreme urges of lust and violence, unshackled by morality and not concerned with higher logic. The structural model divides the mind into three main structures: the id, the ego, and the superego. Firstly, let's talk about the part that is most dominant in the dungeons, the id. Originally in German, the id is called S, which is translated to English as it. This name, the it, seems more appropriate to the id as it is very animalistic. According to this theory, a person is born only with the id. Even later in life, when more mature parts develop, the id stays very infantile. It is completely blind to reality, not understanding the differences between fantasy and reality, and on top of that it is completely amoral. The only thing that the id is concerned with is using simple reflexes like blinking your eye when something is bothering it to try and maximize pleasure and minimize pain. It is the part most connected to the body and the first to feel things concerning it, like hunger. Even though it is all about those basic urges, it is not very good at satisfying them alone. If it doesn't have the thing that would satisfy those urges right in front of it, it would fantasize about them instead. Just like a baby sucking its thumb when his mother is not there to feed it and it's hungry. The id is also the source of the two drives that fuel all human behavior. The first is the life drive, also called eros, using libido, sexual energies, for fuel. In adults, eros in a more raw form is seen mostly in sexual adult activities. However, in a less raw form, after being transformed or filtered by another part called the ego I'll talk about later, libido can be used for all kinds of creative activities. For example, designing a building or healing the sick. The second drive is known as the death drive or thanatos. This drive is using death drive energy that doesn't have a special name like the libido as far as I know. In contrast to libido used for creation and sustaining of life, death drive energies are used for destruction and ending of life. In its most raw form, like it is in the id, thanatos can be an external force of destruction like unhinged violence against other people. However, fundamentally, thanatos is actually a self-destructive force. Just like libido, the death drive energies can be transformed and filtered by the ego in order to use them for a variety of different destructive activities and thoughts. For example, waging war, working a dangerous job, and even letting yourself get addicted to a drug that will slowly destroy your body and mind. Even if you didn't watch my previous video, the connections between Sylvian and Eros and Gregory and Thanatos should be pretty clear. Sylvian is not only the goddess of love and creation, she is the source of the concept of creation itself. She is the one that created the world and everything in it. On top of that, the only way to worship Sylvian is to perform sexual acts. implying that in the world of fear and hunger, creativity is fueled by sexuality, just like the idea of libido and eros. Similar connections can be made between Double G and Thanatos. Gorygoth being the god of destruction and the source of all destruction, and the way of worshipping him being destroying others or yourself. But there is another old god I haven't mentioned yet that is very important to the Id, maybe even more so than the other two I've mentioned. There are a lot of evidence to suggest that the God of the Depths is the one most responsible to the changes the people trapped in the dungeons are going through. It is true that both Sylvian and Grogarov are able to change people and control them body and mind. We can see it in the marriages for Sylvian, and we can see it for both of them in the orgies and how people can completely give in to the raw Eros and Thanatos and completely lose control. If you believe the stories of the Dark Priests, Sylvian even controlled the entire human race for a short period of time. She made them completely give in to their Id, and specifically Eros, making a huge orgy of the entire human race that you could only describe as apocalyptic. With all that said, I think in the dungeons, Sylvian and Gargamel are mainly amplifying the strength of the urges coming from Eros and Thanatos. The dungeons are full of animals aligned with the god of the depths. Cockroaches, vermin, maggots, and of course crows, and Rudimer turns into a crow person after all. On top of that, the cave dwellers in the mines are worshipping the cube of the depths, implying that they were turned by the god of the depths as well, and those are just two examples. It seems that the god of the depths is a god of the Id as a whole, slowly corrupting the other parts of the mind that were already weak from the harsh environment, maybe even destroying them completely and leaving people controlled by the Id and close to the vermin that worships it, both body and mind. There is something very important I didn't tell you yet about the Id. If we saw the mind as an iceberg, above water would be our conscious feelings and thoughts. Right below that would be the pre-conscious, mostly memories, things that we can bring into consciousness but don't think about or feel right now. Even deeper below that lies the biggest part of the mind according to Freud, the unconscious. Only here, in the deepest parts of the human mind, is the realm of the Id alone, unfiltered. Maybe the god of the depths is not only a god of the depths of the dungeons, but also a god of the depths of the human mind. Now let's go to the extreme opposite. The super ego. No, that's not good enough. The super ego. This is so stupid. What's with this? This is not a perfect circle. This is clearly not a perfect circle. Like, fucking hell. Let's see. I open this thing and I'll remake it. Yes. The super ego, or in its original German Über-Ich, which is translated to something roughly like above the self. The one thing that is similar between the Id and the super ego is that they are both disconnected from reality. While the Id is deep underground, you could say that the super ego is in the clouds. This is where our moral compass and ideal self are located. The superego is the last structure of the mind to be developed, and it develops around the ages of 3 to 5 according to Freud. At the start, things like morality are governed by outside forces, mostly our teachers and parents, through punishments and rewards for certain behavior. Slowly, what is considered moral and idealized by our society is internalized and turns into the superego. That way, if you do something immoral, your superego will punish you with feelings of guilt or shame. On top of that, the superego will make you strive towards an ideal self, a perfect self that you will never reach. Well, unless... we will get to that. Now let's talk about the part that keeps it all together and the only one that has boots on the ground, the ego, or in the original German, Ich, which is translated to I. Once again, the original name is more appropriate, as when you say I, you really mean the ego. The ego is the most conscious part of the self, and the one that one most identifies with. If we go back to the iceberg metaphor, the ego would be mostly above water, representing our surface thoughts and feelings. The ego is the only structure that actually feels, even feelings that come from the other structures. Because the ego is the only structure connected to reality and the only one that can function effectively in it, the other parts are dependent on it to achieve their own goals in reality. For example, the id bubbling up urges of hunger that only the ego can really satisfy in reality. The ego has the important job to come to realistic compromises between the extremes of the superego and the id. Let's say, for example, I'm recording this very audio you're listening to right now, and all of a sudden my belly rumbles and I feel hunger. If the superego completely had its way, it would have me walk until I starve and probably had me re-record audio again and again and again until it was perfect, which it will do. God damn it. Which it will never be. If the id was in control, however, it would probably not work on anything in the first place. It would jerk off, then realize it was hungry, go outside through the window, naked and without any money, locate the nearest convenience store, located where all the chocolate is, then start eating all of it, right there and then, because it is delicious. If anyone would try to stop it, it would bite them, then take as much chocolate as it can and run to a safe place, but then get run over by a car because it doesn't comprehend the concept of roads. In reality, with all of the structures balanced and the ego able to reach a realistic compromise, I would actually think that I'm on a roll and I should keep recording for a bit. Then I would go to the fridge and eat some leftovers, and I would give myself one cookie because I've earned it. However, sometimes the pressures from reality and the other structures is too much for the ego, and it will unconsciously use defense mechanisms to twist reality a little bit in order to be able to digest it better. For example, repressing traumatic memories into the unconscious. While defense mechanisms do take energy to actively maintain and twist reality, they are still necessary in order to function. Therefore, according to Freud, a mentally healthy person will sometimes use defense mechanisms to at least twist reality a little bit. However, when your reality is insane, extremely insane, like the one you find in the dungeons, you start to twist it more than a little bit. With that, let's go back to Captain Rudimer, specifically to before he entered the dungeons of fear and hunger. Keep in mind that we don't know a lot about how Rudimer really was before the dungeons, so this part is almost pure speculation. From his letters, I think it's clear that Rudimer did have a strong moral compass. However, as a hardened soldier, he also had the ability to completely disregard his moral compass and commit some really immoral acts if he was ordered to by the higher ups in the army. In his first diary entry, when he talks about torture, This name is unironically torturing me. It's like it's almost torture, but some of the letters are different. Like, I'm just gonna call him torture. Anyways, we can see in the first diary that Captain Rudimer sees the actions of torture as wicked and going too far. On top of that, he sometimes thinks about even killing torture to do the world a favor, in his words. However, we also see that Rudimer doesn't keep torture in the dungeons because he is useful to him as a torturer. He keeps him around out of a sense of respect and honor to the old knight torture used to be before he was captured in battle and tortured for who knows how much time. He even says that Torture was a war hero and adored by many before he transformed into this little torture goblin. It is not known how close the two were, but maybe they even fought side by side as brothers in arms. Maybe Rudimer keeps him around also out of obligation for an old comrade and friend. On one hand, the strong feelings of disgust and anger about the immorality of the actions of torture, and on the other, a strong value for honoring an old war hero and even staying by the side of a friend or maybe a comrade, even after he became a monster, shows that Rudimer did indeed have a strong moral compass, and that his super ego, as we will see later, saw the things going on in the dungeons as evil at best. While we don't have a lot of information that would give us a clear image of the ideal self of Captain Rudimer, as we don't know a lot about him or the society he grew up in, we can still take some educated guesses about what would his ideal self look like. We do know that Rudimer was a high-ranking leader in a medieval army. That knowledge alone would give us some information about the ideal self of Rudimer. If we believe that Captain Rudimer got his position mostly because of his skills and not out of nepotism or any other form of corruption, the ideal self of Captain Rudimer would probably involve him being very competent at personal combat and leading men into war. Getting to a high rank in the army could also mean that Captain Rudimer was pretty ambitious and kept pushing his real self toward his ideal self all the time. In the secondary entry, Rudimer already admits that he can barely control the troops and that there are higher forces at play in the dungeons, way stronger than him. Going from a captain successfully controlling his troops to barely keeping them in line and even alive, while stronger forces that you don't understand show you clearly that they are the one in charge, probably heavily harm the self-image of Rudimer and put his realistic self in his mind further away from his ideal self, a lot farther than he used to be at least, making his super ego put even more pressure on his ego. At the same time that the super ego put pressure on the ego of Rudimer from above, the id put a lot of pressure from below. We can learn about the id of Captain Rudimer from two sources. The first one, once again, is his job in the army. Being a captain in a medieval army involves surrounding yourself in death. Not only did Rudimer have to send his soldiers to kill or be killed, he had to probably kill a lot of people himself. In comparison to modern warfare, he also had to kill them up close and personal, making his violent acts even more brutal in a way. From a Freudian point of view, Rudimer would have to be born with a big reserve of death energy in order to commit such acts consistently. Not only that, but the fact that Rudimer would even choose such a job would be because he would need a way to bring out his violent urges in a way that is both realistic and accepted by society, and also by extension accepted by his superego. Through a defense mechanism called sublimation, Rudimer can convert his socially unacceptable, pure, destructive and violent urges into destroying his enemies in battle, which will not only be considered acceptable but heroic and desirable by society and his superego both. The other source that can teach us about the Id of Captain Rudimer is the man himself after he transformed into Growmauler. As we will see in more details later, the God of the Depths almost completely destroys the ego and superego slowly, leaving people as almost pure Id, with only basic functions of the ego still working, like knowing how to wield weapons. As I said before, the presence of Sylvian and Gory G in the dungeons seems to amplify the urges of Eros and Thanatos that are already present in the people trapped in the dungeons, while creatures like the gods seems to be motivated by exaggerated raw forms of Eros and Thanatos. Growmauler is only motivated by Thanatos. Growmauler doesn't seem to have any lustful desires. The only thing that matters to him is to purge the dungeons, to destroy everything in its way. This implies that even before his transformation, Rudimer had a bigger pool of death drive energy than libido, which aligns nicely with the previous points I made about his military lifestyle. Finally, let's focus on the structure that has to juggle all the bullshit of the other structures and handle the shit life throws at it as well. The Ego of Captain Rudimer. The fact that Rudimer was able to keep a coherent journal months after entering the dungeons shows alone that his ego was pretty strong. Even after months of insane pressure coming from the other structures and the insane reality of the dungeons, the ego of Rudimer was still intact. When we enter the dungeons, who knows how many months after the last daily entry of Rudimer, most of the characters we meet already had their ego completely destroyed. The exceptions for this rule, like Nasra, the Dark Priests, and Torture, 1. Were amoral before they entered the dungeons, therefore less pressure from the superego on the ego, and 2. Seems to have big chunks of unfiltered id integrated into their ego. Torture just gleefully torturing people, and Nasra just burning people alive or even a little bit annoying him and doing it with great pleasures, are both examples of unfiltered death drive working in harmony with the ego. But let's go back to Rudimer. As we already discussed, as soon as Rudimer stepped into the dungeons, his ego was already pressured by the superego and id. But another source of pressure for the ego is reality itself. The ego of Rudimer had the unenviable task of planning ahead and making decisions in order to, on one hand, keep his troops alive and fed, and on the other hand, keeping them sane and uncorrupted. We can see in the second diary that Rudimer had a problem with keeping this balance very early on. He already regrets by then taking this position, but it's too late. Also, he already had to take difficult decisions like cannibalizing the soldiers who killed themselves in order to keep the ones who are still alive fed. This type of decisions and the fact that he had to supply the fucked up rituals of the Dark Priests with prisoners and even give them Lagarde, and his frustration with having to go along with these unholy rituals show the pressure the superego is putting on his ego already for making difficult decisions that, no matter what he chose, would compromise his moral compass in some way. As stated before, the ego can use defense mechanisms in order to twist reality and make it more digestible. In the second diary entry, Rudimer speaks about the fucked up things going on in the dungeons in a matter-of-fact way, and he even outright says that all the gore and macabre scenery had become trivial to him. If we look at this situation not from the point of view of the theories of Freud, we could say that Rudimer just got desensitized to all of the fucked up things going on because he was constantly exposed to them. However, from a Freudian point of view, Rudimer is unconsciously using a defense mechanism called isolation. With this defense mechanism in action, the intense feelings Rudimer has about the fucked up things going on are isolated, leaving him only with matter-of-fact observation, which helps him function. Using this defense mechanism of isolation may help Rudimer deal with reality for now, but it also takes energy from him constantly and will contribute to how exhausted he is later on. With that said, his ego was still very close to reality at this point. He even admits that there are stronger powers at play, powers that no mortal can fight against, showing that at this point he could still deal with pretty harsh realities consciously. Later on we can see another proof for how preserved the ego and superego of Rudimer are at this point. He talks about how conflicted he was about handing Lagarde over to the Dark Priests, and for multiple reasons as well. First of all, he talks about the high worth of Lagarde as a prisoner and propaganda alone. He admits that realistically he doesn't think anything good will come out of giving Lagarde to the Dark Priests, yet he gave him away anyways because orders are orders. With that said, he still feels bad for the man, and it is obvious to him that the Kingdom of London stabbed him in the back, mainly because he was gaining influence way too rapidly. We can see here the ego of Rudimer successfully being a mediator between two sides of himself. On one side there is moral considerations from his moral compass inside the superego, and realistic considerations coming from his ego. Morally, he doesn't think that giving away Lagarde to the Dark Priests and the torturous rituals is fair. On top of that, he sees the rituals of the Dark Priest as a whole as unholy. On the same side, but coming from the ego instead of the superego, are pragmatic considerations about how Lagarde is wasted on the rituals of the Dark Priests and how nothing good will come out of them. On the other side, coming from the superego as well, is his high value for staying loyal and obedient to his higher ups in the army. With this value held so highly by Rudimer that it won over his morality and what he thought should be done realistically both. Which makes sense, as obeying your orders above everything else is something that is taught to soldiers from day one, and is something that is especially present in medieval armies where your leaders may be considered chosen by God. The difference in the mental state of Rudimer between the second entry and the third is massive. The third diary entry starts with Rudimer admitting that he's been having feverish dreams for a long time now. He sees otherworldly patterns in the dreams and constantly hears the calls of crows. When he tries to replicate those patterns, like telling them to another person or writing them on paper, he is unable to. They don't have a concrete form, they're always changing. And Rudimer admits that humans probably can't even comprehend them. The thing that is even more concerning is that even when Rudimer is awake, everything he sees reminds him of the dreams and the patterns in them. He even swears that he saw a similar shape to the ones in the dreams in the intestines of a guarded prisoner. With a couple of mentions of crows and the fact that Rudimer becomes Growmauler later on, this is obviously the god of the depths sinking deep into Rudimer. By this point, the ego of Rudimer was exhausted and overwhelmed. And when the ego is very exhausted and very overwhelmed, it starts to twist reality a lot, in order to try and digest it and keep everything together. We can see it in Rudimer with the border between reality and dreams being blurred and even broken. The God of the Depths helped in overwhelming the ego of Rudimer by giving him feverish dreams, and when the ego was weak enough, he breached the border between reality and dreams and invaded Rudimer's perception of reality. With the ego being so weak, it is way less effective at filtering the id. A huge amount of raw death drive energy amplified by the presence of Greg in the dungeons can now bubble up into the conscious. As the id is invading Rudimer's ego from below, the superego is invading from above, pumping the ego with feelings of guilt and righteous rage about the things Rudimer saw and did until now in the dungeons. This righteous rage, together with the unfiltered death drive energies that urge Rudimer to indulge in extreme violence, combine into a delusional quest to purge the dungeons alone with violence. To root out the madness coming from forces Rudimer himself admits he can barely comprehend. As stated before, both the superego and the id are not connected to reality at all. With the ego so weak, idealistic fantasies of righting the wrong of the dungeons coming from the superego all of a sudden seems very realistic. With no filter for the id, it is more than happy to supply this righteous crusade with death drive energy. After Rudimer finished writing this diary entry, he most likely went on a rampage, killing anything and everything that stood in his way in the dungeons. But instead of rooting out the madness by giving in to his raw destructive urges, Rudimer just became a part of it. By the time we meet Rudimer in the game, it doesn't seem like he can even speak anymore. It seems like he's walking on pure instincts. With his ego almost completely gone, the superego collapsed, leaving no trace of the higher goals or moral compass Rudimer used to have. The idealistic dreams of purging the evil of the dungeons are no more. The only thing that's left is a beast following its death drive to destroy anyone foolish enough to enter the dungeons. Ironically enough, Rudimer became kind of a protector of the God of the Depths, keeping intruders away from the fragile organs of the dying god. The only thing left of the man that once was called Rudimer is a puppet of the God of the Depths and his own id. This is where this overly long video should have ended, but there is another place in the game that destroys the self, but in a quite different way. If you are competent and ambitious enough to survive the dangers of the dungeons while also keeping your sanity intact, going deeper and deeper, you will eventually find the buried city beneath it. This city is familiar to all of the people living in the world of fear and hunger because sometimes they'll see it in their dreams. With the right artifacts and knowledge, you can travel to the golden age of this city of dreams. In the heart of it, after many trials and tribulations, you will finally find your prize, a golden throne fit for a god. If you got to this point, you deserve to sit on it. You earned it. But what did you earn? What is your prize? Remember when I said you can never reach your ideal self? That is only true for mortals. If you became a god on the other hand, well, that's a different story. But I'll keep this story for another day. As I've already said, this video has been long enough. Thank you very much for reaching the end of this video. Originally I thought this video was going to be way shorter. Foolishly I didn't write a script for it, which made it way messier to make and left me with an end product that was a bit bloated. If you watched my previous video and was waiting for this one, I would like to also sincerely apologize for taking so long to make this one. On top of the fact that this video became bigger than I expected, I also have some real life obligations to take care of. Also, I'm a massive procrastinator, which didn't help. I was very pleasantly surprised to see such a positive reception on my last video. I kind of expected to throw it into the void and not get any response. For how cruel the Fear and Hunger games are, the community around it is very friendly and pleasant. So if anyone watching is thinking about making their own videos or maybe fan art of the game, just go for it. It doesn't really matter how good you are, the community will accept it with open arms. Thank you for stopping by the junkyard, and have a nice day.